I'm Julie of Quilt, and welcome back to the Quilts for Baby and Beyond Sew Along. Today we are going to work on making a Cuddles quilt. Cuddles comes in 3 sizes: an adult size, a baby size, and a doll quilt. We're going to focus on making either the baby or the adult quilt. Let's get started. Many fabrics are what's called a tossed design, and what that means is that the direction of the items on it doesn't matter in regards to how you cut. In this example, there are birds that are facing this way, this way, this way, this way. So regardless of how I cut this, it's going to look great in the quilt. There are prints though that are directional prints, like this one. And this directional print has dinosaurs and palm trees, and they are all oriented with this being the bottom. As such, you may not want a dinosaur standing on its head or sideways in your quilt. And what that means is you'll have to pay close attention to how you do your cutting. In this situation, I'm working on the Cuddles quilt. And the Cuddles quilt, all of the pieces are going to be oriented up and down. And I want to make sure that I have my diamonds that way so that my dinosaurs aren't sideways or standing on their head. The directions for the pattern, as most patterns, suggest to begin cutting the fabric with a fabric. That's the most economical way to cut fabric. If you cut the fabrics this way for Cuddles, you'd have your dinosaurs like this, which is not how we want them. So instead of cutting strips with the fabric, I suggest cutting them length of fabric. You may need to purchase a little bit more fabric to accommodate this as well. So I have gone ahead and cut 2 strips for this demo, length of fabric. So what that means is my selvage was along here, and I then cut this along the length of the piece that I purchased, and I have a second piece that I've done that, and I've now put them wrong sides together, and I'm going to line them up. And what this will do is every cut will give me a mirror image. So I'm going to spin this around. My first cut is going to be my angle of my diamond. Now I'm going to spin that around. And cut. And I'm going to do that down the length of the strip to get enough diamonds as described on page 39 of the book for this quilt. But by cutting with the fabrics wrong sides together, I get 2 cuts from each. So I have one where the dinosaurs are pointing up to the left, and I get one where the dinosaurs are pointing up to the right. If I didn't do this and I cut all of my fabrics just with the right side up, what that would end up doing is I would have some of my dinosaurs would be like that. So I'll show you an example of 2 cut with the right side. So some of my dinosaurs would be correct and some would be sideways. Use the directions on page 39 to cut as many diamonds and half triangles needed for the quilt size you are making. If you plan to make your quilt with a non-directional print or an ombre such as this, you can go ahead and cut your fabrics with a fabric following the directions in the pattern instead of the length of fabric directions that I explained for directional prints. I'm making a few Cuddles quilts right now. The dinosaurs is for my niece Ellie, and this is going to be for my son William. For this one I used the white on white from Tula Pink's line work collection, along with this blue and green yellow ombre print from her Daydreamer collection. I cut the pieces with the fabric, and it gave me a great variety of blues and greens and light yellows and limes. I just arranged them in a scrappy manner, spreading out the blues, the lime greens, and the yellows until I was happy with the layout. After cutting all the diamonds, there's one more step that's very helpful before we begin piecing. It's not required, but it really does help with setting up for success when arranging pieces at the sewing machine. And what that is cutting the sharp points off of our diamonds. And this is how we do that. Take a diamond that is already cut, place it underneath the Sidekick ruler so that the solid triangle line and the edge of the ruler are along the 2 edges of the diamond, like this. And then just trim off that tiny little point. rotate it around, and repeat. You can do a couple layers at a time, but things very easily shift, so I don't suggest doing more than 2 or 3 at a time. So I'll trim one more and show you why we're going to take the time to do this, because it's really going to help us with the alignment of our pieces. So again, the triangle line, edge of my ruler, trim, and trim. And if you are left-handed, that's going to look like this. You're going to have your piece like this. Line up your ruler, your triangle line, your base of your ruler, trim, rotate around. So once you have those trimmed, now when we put our diamonds together, we have alignment points. So when you see when I place these right sides together, I know exactly where to line them up, and I'm going to sew from that point to that point with a scant 1/4 inch seam, and my pieces are perfectly going to line up here after I sew them. Without those, it can be hard to know exactly where to line it up. You might end up too far over here, too far over here. Obviously, I'm exaggerating, but you know, it's natural sometimes to just think to put it right there and right there. And what happens if you do that, when you open it, is you don't have a straight line here. And very easily you could just be a little bit too far one way or the other, and it's going to compound and make it hard to line up your points from column to column. So by trimming those off, we know exactly where to line things up. So I'm going to go ahead and trim the sharp points off all of my diamonds. The Cuddles quilt is assembled in columns. You can go ahead and lay it out all on your design wall and sew each column one at a time, as shown on page 41, or a time-saving trick is to sew the pieces together in pairs and go ahead and put those pairs up on your design wall. Just note that each column has an odd number of pieces, so don't sew all of your diamonds, as you'd end up with too many pairs. When sewing those pairs, it's also important to note, if you have a directional fabric, what the placement is. So you want to make sure that all of your pieces that point up, like this one, are sewn together like this, and all of your pieces that point up this way are sewn together like this, and that you don't accidentally start flipping them and doing this, because then you'd have dinosaurs that are not facing up, or whatever your directional print happens to be. So to put these two pieces together, since I've gone ahead and trimmed off my sharp points, it's as simple as flipping them together, lining those up, and sewing my scant 1/4 inch seam. Scant is just one thread over So then this pair, so that my dinosaurs face up this way, would look like this. Again, since I trimmed off my sharp points, just go ahead and line those up. And I'm going to repeat this process with the majority of my stack here, making sure that I leave enough pieces to fill in at the bottom of my quilt. Once I have my pairs together, it's time to continue sewing to create my columns as shown on page 41. And the next step is to add my half triangles. And they simply are placed right sides together like this, with the extra point overhanging. If you'd like to help with alignment, as we did when we trimmed the sharp points off of the diamonds, just go ahead and trim that sharp point off using the same technique, and then you'll know exactly where to line up this piece. And since this is the edge of the quilt, I'm going to backstitch a little bit. Then we're going to go ahead and take a piece for the next column. And there's my half triangle that's going to go on that one. And if you don't cut your sharp point off, that should be a 1/4 inch right where your valley starts. And I'm just going to continue chain piecing to add enough pieces to each column to complete my first 2 columns. After sewing the diamonds together to create the column, it's time to go ahead and press. And we want to make sure we are pressing our seams open so that things lay flat. If you want and you have a light and a dark, you could decide to nest. This is one project where that would work. So you could press to the dark here and to the dark here and nest those seams when we go to sew the columns. I'm going to go ahead and press my seams open. So I'm just going to start by finger pressing them open. And then I'm going to take my iron and my heat resistant stiletto and press. We don't want to iron. We don't want to stretch our bias that we're working with. We don't want to push the seam. We just want to press. So pressing is up and down with a little wiggle. Ironing is pushing the iron. We do not want to iron. We want to press. I know I say that often, so if you've watched other videos of mine, you've heard me say that before, but I can't say it enough because this is often the step where people accidentally default back to ironing and as a result end up stretching these seams. So I'm going to continue to press all of my seams and head back to my machine to begin sewing my columns together. Once you have your first 2 columns pieced and pressed, it's time to go ahead and sew them together. And I pressed these seams open. That I like that they lay flat. This is, however, one of the few Jaybird projects that if you wanted to press towards one direction and nest together, that would work for this. It does not work for most projects, but it would work for this. So go ahead and press as you prefer. And to go ahead and sew these together, we're just going to place them right sides together like this and sew our scant 1/4 inch seam down the length. And I am choosing not to pin, and I'm going to do what's called the peel up method, which is as I get close to each intersection, I'm just going to peel it up. Now we have some pieces here that are bias and some that are straight of grain based off of how we cut, and so things can easily stretch. So I just want to go nice and slow. I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and just give a little tug as needed to shift things. And sew down the length of my piece. After sewing 2 columns together, it's time to go ahead and press this seam. I'm also going to press this open so that my quilt overall lays as flat as possible. Simply going to start by finger pressing it open. With this quilt, I did not trim off my points, so you see them here now showing up in my seam allowance. With my dinosaurs, I did trim them, so if you trimmed yours, you won't have these here. If you didn't trim them, you will. Either way, it's totally fine. I don't go ahead and cut them off now. They don't bother me, and I don't really have issues with them showing through with the quilting. So I'm going to, again, use my heat-resistant stiletto, and I'm going to press, not iron. It can be tempting to iron since I'm doing one long seam and just go, but I have a greater chance of stretching bias. So I'm simply going to pick it up, slight little wiggle, and move my way down the length of the seam. Now I suggest repeating this process, sewing every pair together to create one wider column. You'll then have 5 columns like this. So these from the top to the bottom. Then once you have all 5 columns like this and you go to sew these seams, I suggest sewing these from the bottom up. That way you can still do the peel up technique at the machine, or if you've decided to press to a side, you can go ahead and nest them. So sew these down and then sew these up and repeat that until you have finished your quilt top. After completing both of these quilt tops, I sent them off to Teresa Silva of Quilting Is My Bliss. I had her do a pantograph called Silver on both of them. And if you look carefully, you can see that the scale is different, which adds some variety. So here you see this swirl, and it's much smaller over here, but it's actually the same design. Now that I have these quilted, I went ahead and trimmed off the excess batting and backing, and it's time to go ahead and bind them. I'm going to go ahead and bind this large adult Cuddles in the pink binding that I made a couple weeks ago. It is bias binding. I like bias binding because it will wear better over time for a quilt like this that is going to get a lot of use. I'm now going to go ahead and sew it on the front of my quilt using a 1/4 inch seam. I've sewn my binding on and I'm back where I started, so I'm now going to take my quilt out from underneath my machine and turn it towards myself so that I can figure out how long to cut this piece to get these to match up perfectly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my starting tail out of the way. I'm going to take my ending tail and I'm going to make sure my quilt's flat, and I'm going to line up my ending tail along my raw edge here. And then I'm simply going to open it up and take my starting tail and lay it right on top. And I'm going to take a pencil. I'm just going to draw right here. Okay. Now I need to add a 1/2 inch so that I have enough for a seam allowance. Go ahead and take a ruler. I just want to make sure I keep it on the 45-degree and line up that line with my 1/2 inch. Draw another line. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut that. And move the rest of my binding out of the way, save that for another project. Now I have these two ends, and I want to make sure that I don't get them twisted, but I need to go ahead and sew my 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to match them up and just double check to make sure that I didn't twist them. Sometimes you can accidentally twist one and not realize it, and then you end up with that. So make sure you keep them nice and flat and just match them up. And you just kind of bunch up your quilt here in the middle to keep those together. Just going to go underneath my machine. And so these were the 1/4 inch seam, same as if I was piecing 2 binding strips together. Want to make sure I don't end up with that thread nest, so I'm going to sew on a scrap real quick. And then onto my piece. Okay, trim that scrap off. And now when I open this up, it should lay nice and flat and be perfect, and you won't be able to tell which seam is where I started and ended compared to any other seam in the quilt. I'm just going to go ahead and press this open. I'm not going to bother to take my iron out. I'm just going to finger press it. If you have your seam roller handy, it's a tool I like to use often. You can go ahead and roll that seam. And I'm going to go back under my machine and finish sewing my binding in place. And now I just can go ahead and wrap my binding around to the back and clip with Wonder Clips, and now I can go ahead and sew this by hand or by machine. Thank you for joining us here today. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like it, subscribe, and share your comments with us. You can also turn on notifications to receive an alert every time that I publish a new video. We're looking forward to seeing your Cuddles quilts. Share them with us on social media using #JaybirdBaby. I'll be back here next week to teach you how to make the Rookie of the Year quilt. See you soon.